and get better. So, I mean, look, the place where I disagree with the characterization, first, I thought, some of the reporting and coverage of it just took the whole thing out of proportion, and that it focused on, as you said, I think there were like 20 metrics in there, and on 18 or 19, the effect of using Instagram was neutral or positive on the teen's well-being. And there was one area where I think it showed that we needed to improve, and we took some steps to try to do that after doing the research. But I think having the coverage just focus on that one without focusing on the, I mean, I think an accurate characterization would have been that kids using Instagram, or not kids, teens, um, is generally positive for their mental health. But of course, that was not the narrative that came out. So I think it's hard to. That's not a kind of logical thing to straw man, but I sort of disagree, or steel man. But I sort of disagree with that overall characterization. I think anyone sort of looking at this um, objectively would. Um, but then, I mean, there is this sort of intent critique that I think you were getting at before, which says, it assumes some sort of malevolence, right? It's like, um, which it's really hard for me to really wrap my head around this, because as far as I know, it's not clear that any of the other tech companies are doing this kind of research. So why the narrative should form that we did research, because we were studying an issue because we wanted to understand it to improve, and took steps after that to try to improve it, that your interpretation of that would be that we did the research and tried to sweep it under the rug. It sort of is like, I don't know, it's beyond credibility to me that like that's the accurate description of the actions that we've taken compared to the others in the industry. So I don't know, that's my view on it. These are really important issues, and there's a lot of stuff that I think we're going to be working on related to teen mental health for a long time, including trying to understand this better. And I would encourage everyone else in the industry to do this too.
Yeah, I would love there to be open conversations and a lot of great research being released internally and then also externally. It doesn't make me feel good to see press obviously get way more clicks when they say negative things about social media. Objectively speaking, I can just tell that there's hunger to say negative things about social media, and I don't understand how that's supposed to lead to an open conversation about the positives and the negatives, the concerns about social media, especially when you're doing that kind of research. I mean, I don't know what to do with that, but let me ask you, as a father, does it weigh heavy on you that people get bullied on social networks? So people get bullied in their private life, but now, because so much of our life is in the digital world, the bullying moves from the physical world to the digital world. So you're now creating a platform on which bullying happens, and some of that bullying can lead to damage to mental health, and some of that bullying can lead to depression, even suicide. Does it weigh heavy on you that people have committed suicide or will commit suicide based on the bullying that happens on social media?
Yeah, I mean, this is there's a set of harms that we basically track and build systems to fight against, and bullying and self-harm are, I mean, these are some of the biggest things that we are most focused on. For bullying, like you say, it's going to be, while this predates the internet, and it's probably impossible to get rid of all of it. You want to give people tools to fight it, and you want to fight it yourself, and you also want to make sure that people have the tools to get help when they need it. So I think this isn't like a question of, can you get rid of all bullying? I mean, it's like, all right, I mean, I have two daughters, and they fight and push each other around and stuff too. And the question is just how do you handle that situation? And there's a handful of things that I think you can do. We talked a little bit before around some of the AI tools that you can build to identify when something harmful is happening. It's very hard in bullying, because a lot of bullying is very context specific. It's not like you're trying to fit a formula of like, if like looking at the different harms, Someone promoting a terrorist group is like probably one of the simpler things to generally find, because things promoting that group are gonna, look a certain way or feel a certain way. Bullying could just be, someone making some subtle comment about someone's appearance that's idiosyncratic to them.
And it could look at just like humor. So
Yeah,
humor to one person could
exactly.
be destructive to another
Yeah.
human being. Yeah.
So with bullying, I think there are certain things that you can find through AI systems, but I think it is increasingly important to just give people more agency themselves. So we've done things like making it so people can turn off comments, or take a break from hearing from a specific person without having to signal at all that they're going to stop following them, or kind of make some stand that, okay, I'm not friends with you anymore, or I'm not following you. I just don't want to hear about this, but I also don't want to signal at all publicly that or to them that there's been an issue. And then you get to some of the more extreme cases like you're talking about, where someone is thinking about self-harm or suicide, and there we've found that is a place where AI can identify a lot, as well as people flagging things. If people are expressing something that is potentially they're thinking of hurting themselves, those are cues that you can build systems in hundreds of languages around the world to be able to identify that. And one of the things that I'm actually quite proud of is we've built these systems that I think are clearly leading at this point, that not only identify that, but then connect with local first responders, and have been able to save, I think at this point, it's, in thousands of cases, be able to get first responders to people through these systems who really need them, because of specific plumbing that we've done between the AI work and being able to communicate with local first responder organizations. And we're rolling that out in more places around the world. And I think the team that worked on that just did awesome stuff. So I think that's a long way of saying, yeah, I mean, this is a heavy topic, and you want to attack it in a bunch of different ways, and also kind of understand that some of nature is for people to do this to each other, which is unfortunate, but you can give people tools and build things that help.
It's still one hell of a burden, though. A platform that allows people to fall in love with each other is also by nature going to be a platform that allows people to hurt each other. And when you're managing such a platform, it's difficult. And I think you spoke to it, but the psychology of that, of being a leader in that space, of creating technology that's playing in this space, like you mentioned, psychology, is really damn difficult. And I mean, the burden of that is just great. I just wanted to hear you speak to that point. I have to ask about the thing you've brought up a few times, which is making controversial decisions. Let's talk about free speech and censorship. So there are two groups of people pressuring Meta on this. One group is upset that Facebook, the social network, allows misinformation, in quotes, to be spread on the platform. The other group are concerned that Facebook censors speech by calling it misinformation. So you're getting it from both sides. You, in 2019, October, at Georgetown University, eloquently defended the importance of free speech. But then COVID came, and the 2020 election came. Do you worry that outside pressures from advertisers, politicians, the public have forced Meta to damage the ideal of free speech that you spoke highly of?
Just to say some obvious things up front, I don't think pressure from advertisers or politicians directly in any way affects how we think about this. I think these are just hard topics. So let me just take you through our evolution from kind of the beginning of the company to where we are now. You don't build a company like this unless you believe that people expressing themselves is a good thing, right? So that's sort of the foundational thing. You can kind of think about our company as a formula where we think giving people voice and helping people connect creates opportunity, right? So those are the two things that we're always focused on, are sort of helping people connect. We talked about that a lot, but also giving people voice and ability to express themselves. And by the way, most of the time when people express themselves, that's not like politically controversial content. It's expressing something about their identity that's more related to the avatar conversation we had earlier in terms of expressing some facet. But that's what's important to people on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes when people feel strongly enough about something, it kind of becomes a political topic. That's sort of always been a thing that we've focused on. There's always been the question of safety in this, which, if you're building a community, I think you have to focus on safety. We've had these community standards from early on, and there are about 20 different kinds of harm that we track and try to fight actively. And we've talked about some of them already. So it includes things like bullying and harassment. It includes things like terrorism or promoting terrorism, inciting violence, intellectual property theft. And in general, I think, call it about 18 out of 20 of those. There's not really a particularly polarized definition of that. I think you're not really going to find many people in the country or in the world who are trying to say we should be fighting terrorist content less. I think that the content where there are a couple of areas where I think that this has gotten more controversial recently, which I'll talk about. And you're right that misinformation is basically is up there, and I think sometimes the definition of hate speech is up there too.
Yes.
But I think in general, most of the content that I think we're working on for safety is not actually, people don't kind of have these questions. So it's sort of this subset. But if you go back to the beginning of the company, this was sort of pre-deep learning days, and therefore, it was me and my roommate Dustin joined me, and like, if someone posted something bad, it was the AI technology did not exist yet to be able to go basically look at all the content, and we were a small enough outfit that no one would expect that we could review it all. Even if like someone reported it to us, we basically did our best, right? It's like someone would report it, and we'd try to look at stuff and deal with stuff. And for call it the first, 7 or 8 years of the company, we weren't that big of a company. For a lot of that period, we weren't even really profitable. The AI didn't really exist to be able to do the kind of moderation that we do today. And then at some point in kind of the middle of the last decade, that started to flip. And it got to the point where we were sort of a larger and more profitable company, and the AI was starting to come online to be able to proactively detect some of the simpler forms of this. So things like pornography. You could train an image classifier to identify what a nipple was, or you can fight against terrorist content.
There's actually papers on this. It's great.
Oh, of course there are.
Technical papers.
Of course there are. Those are relatively easier things to train AI to do than, for example, understand the nuances of what is inciting violence in 100 languages around the world.
Yes.
And not have the false positives of like, okay, are you posting about this thing that might be inciting violence because you're actually trying to denounce it? In which case, we probably shouldn't take that down, right? If you're trying to denounce something that's inciting violence in some kind of dialect in a corner of India, as opposed to, okay, actually you're posting this thing because you're trying to incite violence. Okay, building an AI that can basically get to that level of nuance in all the languages that we serve is something that I think is only really becoming possible now, not towards the middle of the last decade. But there's been this evolution, and I think what happened, people sort of woke up after 2016, and a lot of people are like, okay, the country is a lot more polarized, and there's a lot more stuff here than we realized. Why weren't these internet companies on top of this? And I think at that point, it was reasonable feedback that some of this technology had started becoming possible. And at that point, I really did feel like we needed to make a substantially larger investment. We'd already worked on this stuff a lot, on AI and on these integrity problems, but that we should basically invest, have 1,000 or more engineers basically work on building these AI systems to be able to go and proactively identify this stuff across all these different areas. Okay, so we went and did that. Now we've built the tools to be able to do that, and now I think it's actually a much more complicated set of philosophical rather than technical questions, which is the exact policies, which are, okay, now the way that we basically hold ourselves accountable is we issue these transparency reports every quarter, and the metric that we track is for each of those 20 types of harmful content. How much of that content are we taking down before someone even has to report it to us? Right. So how effective is our AI at doing this? But that basically creates this big question, which is, okay, now we need to really be careful about how proactive we set the AI and where the exact policy lines are around what we're taking down. It's certainly at a point now where, I felt like at the beginning of that journey of building those AI systems, there was a lot of push. There's thinking, okay, you've got to do more. There's clearly a lot more bad content that people aren't reporting, or that you're not getting to, and you need to get more effective at that. And I was pretty sympathetic to that. But then I think at some point along the way, there started to be almost equal issues on both sides of, okay, actually you're kind of taking down too much stuff, right? Or some of the stuff is borderline, and it wasn't really bothering anyone, and they didn't report it. So is that really an issue that you need to take down? Whereas we still have the critique on the other side too, where a lot of people think we're not doing enough. So it's become, as we built the technical capacity, I think it becomes more philosophically interesting almost where you want to be on the line. And I just think like you don't want one person making those decisions. So we've also tried to innovate in terms of building out this independent oversight board, which has people who are dedicated to free expression, but from around the world, who people can appeal cases to. So a lot of the most controversial cases basically go to them, and they make the final binding decision on how we should handle that. And then, of course, their decisions, we then try to figure out what the principles are behind those and encode them into the algorithms.
And how are those people chosen? Which, you're outsourcing a difficult decision.
Yeah, the initial people, we chose a handful of chairs for the group, and we basically chose the people for a commitment to free expression and like a broad understanding of human rights and the trade-offs around free expression,
So
but
they
fundamentally people who are going to lean towards free expression.
towards freedom of speech. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's also this idea of fact checkers. So jumping around to the misinformation questions,
Yeah.
especially during COVID, which is an exceptionally, speaking of polarization.
Yes, I haven't gotten to. Can I
Yes.
speak to the COVID thing? And
Yes.
I mean, I think one of the hardest set of questions around free expression, because you asked about Georgetown, has my stance fundamentally changed? And the answer to that is no. My stance has not changed. It is fundamentally the same as when I was talking about talking at Georgetown from a philosophical perspective. The challenge with free speech is that everyone agrees that there is a line where if you're actually about to do physical harm to people, that there should be restrictions. So, I mean, there's the famous Supreme Court historical example of like you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. The thing that everyone disagrees on is what is the definition of real harm, where I think some people think, okay, this should only be a very literal, I mean, take it back to the bullying conversation we were just having, where is it just harm if the person is about to hurt themselves because they've been bullied so hard, or is it actually harm like as they're being bullied, and kind of at what point in the spectrum is that? And that's the part that there's not agreement on. But I think what people agree on pretty broadly is that when there is an acute threat, that it does make sense from a societal perspective to tolerate less speech that could be potentially harmful in that acute situation. So I think where COVID got very difficult is, I don't think anyone expected this to be going on for years, but if you'd kind of asked, a priori, would a global pandemic where a lot of people are dying and catching this, is that an emergency that where you'd kind of consider it that it's problematic to basically yell fire in a crowded theater? I think that probably passes that test. So I think it's a very tricky situation, but I think the fundamental commitment to free expression is there. And that's what I believe. And again, I don't think you start this company unless you care about people being able to express themselves as much as possible. But I think that's the question, right? Is like, how do you define what the harm is and how acute that is?
And what are the institutions that define that harm? A lot of the criticism is that the CDC, the WHO, the institutions we've come to trust as a civilization to give the line of what is and isn't harm in terms of health policy have failed in many ways, in small ways and in big ways, depending on who you ask. And then the perspective of Meta and Facebook is like, well, where the hell do I get the information of what is and isn't misinformation? So it's a really difficult place to be in, but it's great to hear that you're leaning towards freedom of speech on this aspect. And again, I think this actually calls to the fact that we need to reform institutions that help keep an open mind of what is and isn't misinformation. And misinformation has been used to bully on the internet. I mean, I just have, I'm friends with Joe Rogan, and he is called as a. I remember hanging out with him in Vegas, and somebody yelled, "Stop spreading misinformation." I mean, and there's a lot of people that follow him that believe he's not spreading misinformation. Like, you can't just not acknowledge the fact that there's a large number of people that have a different definition of misinformation. And that's such a tough place to be. Like, who do you listen to? Do you listen to quote unquote experts? Who gets, as a person who has a PhD, I gotta say, I mean, I'm not sure I know what defines an expert, especially in a totally new pandemic or a new catastrophic event, especially when politics is involved, and especially when the news are the media are involved that can propagate sort of outrageous narratives and thereby make a lot of money. Like, what the hell? Where's the source of truth? And then everybody turns to Facebook. It's like, please tell me what the source of truth is.
Well, I mean, how would you handle this if you were in my position?
Is very, 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 very difficult. I would say I would more speak about how difficult the choices are and be transparent about, like, what the hell do you do with this? Like, here, you got exactly ask the exact question you just asked me, but to the broader public. Like, okay, yeah, you guys tell me what to do. So, like, crowdsource it. And then the other aspect is when you spoke really eloquently about the fact that with this, there's this going back and forth, and now there's a feeling like you're censoring a little bit too much. So I would try to be ahead of that feeling. I would now lean towards freedom of speech and say, we're not the ones that are going to define misinformation. Let it be a public debate. Let the idea stand. And I actually place, this idea of misinformation, I place the responsibility on the poor communication skills of scientists. They should be in the battlefield of ideas, and everybody who is spreading information against the vaccine, they should not be censored. They should be talked with, and you should show the data. You should have open discussion, as opposed to rolling your eyes and saying, I'm the expert, I know what I'm talking about. No, you need to convince people. It's a battle of ideas. So that's the whole point of freedom of speech. It's the way to defeat bad ideas is with good ideas, with speech. So, like, the responsibility here falls on the poor communication skills of scientists. Thanks to social media, scientists are not communicators. They have the power to communicate. Some of the best stuff I've seen about COVID from doctors is on social media. It's a way to learn to respond really quickly, to go faster than the peer review process. And so they just need to get way better at that communication. And also, by better, I don't mean just convincing. I also mean speak with humility. Don't talk down to people, all those kinds of things. And as a platform, I would say I would step back a little bit. Not all the way, of course, because there's a lot of stuff that can cause real harm, as we talked about, but you lean more towards freedom of speech, because then people from a brand perspective wouldn't be blaming you for the other ills of society, which there are many. The institutions have flaws. The political divide, obviously politicians have flaws. That's news. The media has flaws that they're all trying to work with. And because of the central place of Facebook in the world, all of those flaws somehow kind of propagate to Facebook. And you're sitting there as Plato, the philosopher, have to answer to some of the most difficult questions being asked of human civilization. So I don't know. Maybe this is an American answer, though, to lean towards freedom of speech. I don't know if that applies globally. So yeah, I don't know. But transparency and saying I think as a technologist, one of the things I sense about Facebook and Meta when people talk about this company is they don't necessarily understand fully how difficult the problem is. You talked about AI has to catch a bunch of harmful stuff really quickly. Just the sea of data you have to deal with. It's a really difficult problem. So, like any of the critics, if you just hand them the helm for a week, let's see how well you can do. Like that, to me, that's definitely something that would wake people up to how difficult this problem is if there's more transparency saying how difficult this problem is. Let me ask you about on the AI front, just because you mentioned language and my ineloquence. Translation is something I wanted to ask you about. And first, just to give a shout out to the supercomputer, you've recently announced the AI Research Supercluster, RSC. Obviously, I'm somebody who loves the GPUs. It currently has 6,000 GPUs. NVIDIA GGX A100s is the systems that have in total 6,000 GPUs. And it will eventually, maybe this year, maybe soon, will have 16,000 GPUs. So it can do a bunch of different kinds of machine learning applications. There's a cool thing on the distributed storage aspect and all that kind of stuff. So one of the applications that I think is super exciting is translation, real-time translation. I mentioned to you that, having a conversation, I speak Russian fluently, I speak English somewhat fluently, and I'm, having a conversation with Vladimir Putin, say, as a use case. Me as a user coming to you as a use case. We both speak each other's language. I speak Russian, he speaks English. How can we have that communication go well with the help of AI? I think it's such a beautiful and a powerful application of AI to connect the world, that bridge the gap, not necessarily between me and Putin, but people that don't have that shared language. Can you just speak about your vision with translation? Because I think that's a really exciting application.
If you're trying to help people connect all around the world, a lot of content is produced in one language, and people and all these other places are interested in it. So being able to translate that just unlocks a lot of value on a day-to-day basis. I mean, so the kind of AI around translation is interesting because it's gone through a bunch of iterations. But the basic state of the art is that you don't want to go through different kind of intermediate symbolic representations of language or something like that. It's you basically want to be able to map the concepts and basically go directly from one language to another, and you just can train bigger and bigger models in order to be able to do that. And that's where the research supercluster comes in. Is basically a lot of the trend in machine learning is just you're building bigger and bigger models, and you just need a lot of computation to train them. So it's not that like the translation would run on the supercomputer. The training of the model, which could have billions or trillions of examples of basically that, you're training models on this supercluster in days or weeks that might take a much longer period of time on a smaller cluster, so it just wouldn't be practical for most teams to do. But the translation work, we're basically getting from being able to go between about 100 languages seamlessly today to being able to go to about 300 languages in the near term. And
so from any language to any other language.
Yeah,
and then that's
it. And part of the issue when you get closer to more languages is some of these get to be pretty not very popular languages, right, where there isn't that much content in them. So you end up having less data, and you need to kind of use a model that you've built up around other examples. And this is one of the big questions around AI, is like, how generalizable can things be? And that I think is one of the things that's just kind of exciting here from a technical perspective.
But capturing, we talked about this with the metaverse, capturing the magic of human-to-human interaction. So me and Putin, okay, again, this is.
I mean, it's a tough example
session.
because you actually both speak Russian and English.
No, but
in the future,
I see it as a Turing test of a kind, because we would both like to have an AI that improves. Because I don't speak Russian that well. He doesn't speak English that well.
Yeah.
It would be nice to outperform our abilities. and
Sure.
it sets a really nice bar, because I think AI can really help in translation for people that don't speak the language at all, but to actually capture the magic of the chemistry through translation, which would make the metaverse super immersive. I
Yeah.
mean, that's exciting. You
Yeah.
remove the barrier of language, period.
Yeah. So when people think about translation, I think a lot of that is they're thinking about text to text, but speech to speech, I think, is a whole another thing. And I mean, one of the big lessons on that, which I was referring to before, is I think early models, it's like, all right, they take speech, they translate it to text, translate the text to another language, and then kind of output that as speech in that language. And you don't want to do that. You just want to be able to go directly from speech in one language to speech in another language and build up the models to do that. And I mean, I think one of there have been, when you look at the progress in machine learning, there have been big advances in the techniques. Some of the advances in self-supervised learning, which I know you talked to Jan about, and he's like one of the leading thinkers in this area. I just think that stuff is really exciting. But then you couple that with the ability to just throw larger and larger amounts of compute at training these models, and you can just do a lot of things that were harder to do before. But we're asking more of our systems too, right? So if you think about the applications that we're going to need for the metaverse, or think about it. Okay, so let's talk about AR here for a second. You're going to have these glasses. They're going to look, hopefully like a normal-ish looking pair of glasses, but they're going to be able to put holograms in the world and intermix virtual and physical objects in your scene. And one of the things that's going to be unique about this compared to every other computing device that you've had before is that this is going to be the first computing device that has all the same signals about what's going on around you that you have. Right? So your phone, you can have it take a photo or a video, but I mean, these glasses are going to, whenever you activate them, they're going to be able to see what you see from your perspective. They're going to be able to hear what you hear because the microphones and all that are going to be right around where your ears are. So you're going to want an AI assistant that's a new kind of AI assistant that can basically help you process the world from this first person perspective, or from the perspective that you have. And the utility of that is going to be huge, but the kinds of AI models that we're going to need are going to be just I don't know, there's a lot that we're going to need to basically make advances in. But I mean, but that's why I think these concepts of the metaverse and the advances in AI are so fundamentally interlinked.
Yeah.
That I mean, they're kind of enabling each other.
Yeah, like the world builder is a really cool idea. Like you could be like a Bob Ross. Like I'm gonna put a little tree right here.
Yeah.
I need a little tree. It's missing a little
Yeah.
tree. And then, but at scale, like enriching your experience in all kinds of ways. You mentioned the assistant too. That's really interesting. How you can have AI assistants helping you out on different levels of sort of intimacy of communication. It could be just like scheduling, or it could be like almost like therapy. Clearly, I need some. So let me ask you, you're one of the most successful people ever. You've built an incredible company that has a lot of impact. What advice do you have for young people today? How to live a life they can be proud of? How to build something that can have a big positive impact on the world?
Well, let's break that down, because I think you proud of, have a big positive impact,
Well, you're actually listening.
and how to live your life are actually three different things that I think, I mean, they could line up, but and also, like, what age of people are you talking to? Because I mean, I can like
High school and college, so you don't really know what you're doing, but you dream big, and you really have a chance to do something unprecedented.
yeah. So I
Also
guess
for
just
people
to,
my age.
okay, so let's maybe start with the kind of most philosophical and abstract version of this.
Yes.
Every night when I put my daughters to bed, we go through this thing, and it's they call it the good night things, because we're basically what we talk about at night. And